Mike Graham here with you until 1 o'clock when Bob Mills will be along. We'll be talking to him before that to find out what's coming up on his show. Now, some people would describe 2017 as a bit of a turbulent year politically. Some people would say that, the idea that Donald Trump became President of the United States of America, the fact that Brexit happened, the referendum result didn't go the way some people wanted it to go. The most astonishing thing that I've found so far this year, and I know it's only 11 hours and 35 minutes long, is that Britons are apparently upbeat about the job cycle future and the house prices coming in this year as well, because according to a YouGov poll, they don't care about the political ramifications of what's been going on. They don't care that there's a certain amount of uncertainty out there in the economic world, and they're actually very optimistic. I find this a staggering poll result, because I didn't think any British people were optimistic about anything. Let's talk to Jonathan Davis, who is an economist and wealth advisor, of course, and generally speaking is quite an optimistic guy. Jonathan, a very happy New Year to you.
And to you too, Mike.
Now, are you as surprised as I am to see the results of this YouGov poll? Because obviously it doesn't mean necessarily that 2018 is going to be a better year for people than 2017. But I'm just quite surprised that people are genuinely optimistic about their sort of economic future.
There are two issues here. One, there's a thing called recency bias. People are prejudiced to expect what's going to come from what has recently been. And the fact is, we haven't had a recession since 2008,
right.
So people feel confident because nothing bad has happened.
Right. Is that sort of kind of what you're used to, as it were? Because people who are younger than perhaps, certainly younger than I am, I don't know about you, haven't seen terrible times, really.
Yeah. Well, exactly. If you're under the age of 40, you largely do struggle due to the cost of accommodation and transportation, and particularly if you haven't made a fortune on houses or on a house or a flat. Yes, you struggle, but basically you look forward and you kind of expect that your future will be like your parents. Problematically, however, the parents I'm talking about, who are the baby boomers, who were born largely from the early 60s to the early 70s, they are practically the luckiest generation in human history, probably forever, before and in the future. So to expect that your future is going to be the same as them is extremely sanguine, and you shouldn't expect it, because it isn't going to happen.
Although bizarrely, this whole sort of survey that's been done by you guys, being called the State of the Nation, we'll get to some of their findings in more detail in a moment. But one of the interesting reports that I saw the other night actually was that the Millenials are going to be one of the most comfortable and well-rewarded generations for a long time, because almost all of them are going to inherit some kind of property from their parents.
Well, that's a big assumption, isn't it? And certainly many will. Many tens, indeed hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, will indeed do so. There's no question. But outside of London and the southeast, you've got half the population. What are they going to inherit? Bearing in mind that people are living well into their 90s, 100s, do you know, within not a particular long time, we're expecting there to be 10,000 110-year-olds.
Right.
In other words, there's going to be a lot of money spent on long-term care. So how much outside of the southeast is actually going to be inherited? I question that. Even within the southeast, again, if you're spending £50,000 a year per spouse, that's potentially £100,000 a year for 10 years, potentially. You're talking about £1 million.
Yeah.
So how much actually is going to be inherited? I'm sure a fair amount, but not as much as the mainstream media would have us believe.
No, indeed. And I suppose the other problem is that the way that some of these deals are structured, if you do own property, it might well turn out that you have to sell it in order just to pay the fees for looking after your elderly parents.
And indeed, there's also inheritance tax, which too many people still are not planning for, which is ridiculous, because it's relatively easy to plan for it and mitigate it. So yes, the most important thing is the recency bias. People are not really looking to 20, 30 years. If they did, they'd be horrified. They're more looking at 2018, 2019. We haven't had a recession since 2008, and that in itself is something people should be concerned about, because if you just look back the last few decades, we've had a recession roughly every decade.
Well, I was going to say, I feel as as though I've been in a recession for as long as I can remember, ever since like the mid-90s. I feel as if I've been in a recession since then.
Well, I would put it in this context. In 2008, we had the biggest economic and financial collapse literally in history. And what the government and the central banks around the world did was they stopped it getting any worse by borrowing massively from the millennials that we're talking about. So, as I say, over the next 10, 20, 30 years, those millennials are going to have to pay back that debt, and the governments are still borrowing. If they had, in fact, let it just do its thing, then, of course, in the short term, it would have been worse, no question. But in the longer term, it would have been much better because we, the people, as in the government, would not have been landed with such massive amounts of debt, which I've just referred to. So what we've had in the last 8 or 9 years since 2008 is lackluster growth, 1 to 2% per annum. And the reality is, and people don't actually realize this, the bulk of the growth has been going to the top 5 or maybe the top 10%. The bottom 60%, according to studies, have been going backwards, and the bit sort of in the top half have been staying still, not going forward, not going backwards. So the rich are definitely getting richer. And by the way, I'm a free market capitalist, so anyone listening to this should not think that I'm some raving lunatic communist. I'm not. The rich are getting richer. The rest of us are staying still or going backwards. And this actually, according to John Maynard Keynes, the god of many people's economics, the definition of a depression doesn't actually include the economy going backwards. It's simply an extended period of slow or no growth. And you know what, Mike? That's exactly what we've had. And because of the massive level of debt that we took out in 2008, and we continue to borrow £50 billion a year. I mean, I remember when £1 billion was a lot of money. Because
me too.
we continue to borrow, I tell you, at some point the piper is going to have to be paid. And that's then when the millennials will really hit it hard.
Yeah, that's what I find astonishing about some of the results of this particular poll. I think my feeling that we've been in a recession for all this time is largely based on the fact that I was making an awful lot of money in the 80s, and you know, comparatively speaking, I've never done that since, and I don't think I ever will. Do you know what I mean? But let's look at some of these findings. Supposedly, how secure is your job in the year ahead? Incredibly, 41% of people think that they have a secure job situation. Now, I mean, that's news to me. I thought most people felt much less kind of secure in their job than they do now.
Well, again, it's exactly like 2006 and 2007. You will remember, many of your listeners will remember, the extraordinary positivity around at that time. You'll remember Gordon Brown in the summer of 2007 saying he's ended boom and bust.
That's right.
To the great, as I say, the great and the bad in the city. And I scoffed at this. I was out there as much as I could, shouting from the rooftops, no, you're joking. Something big is about to happen, and it's going to be dreadful. Only several weeks later, we had the first example of that. Northern Rock went bust. Then 2008, we had the biggest bust in history. So, as I say, we have recency bias, and people feel secure because of what has been for several years. But I'm telling you, it's building up. But I would say to you, there is actually nothing on the horizon suggesting a recession in 2018. 2019 is a different question, but not 2018.
Okay. Now, the other big question, I suppose, is about how stable and strong is Theresa May's government. In my view, not particularly either. According to, again, the State of the Nation figures, if there were a general election tomorrow, which party would you vote for? 32% Labour, 30% Conservative, and also on Jeremy Corbyn, is he doing very well? Yes, 45%. So the Corbyn wave is still there, right?
It's remarkable, and it's horrifying. I mean, we're talking about politicians who support terrorists, who support socialism, and our socialists are avowedly communist. I mean, what more do people need to know about socialism and communism? Communism killed 100 million people. 100 million people in the 20th century. and in some parts of the world continues to do so. Communism is what they have in Venezuela, with 4,000% retail price inflation. I mean, 85% of the population in Venezuela, under so-called democratic socialism, the type that McDonnell, Abbott and Corbyn espouse, they're in abject poverty and penury. I mean, it's horrific. Are the Tories any particularly better? For my mind, no, they're not. They're certainly not free markets, and that's the main reason why we've only got 1 to 2% per annum growth. If we had free market capitalism, I assure you, we'd have greater growth.
Indeed we would. Well, Jonathan, listen, let's hope that the optimism spreads to all points, west, north, south and east, and you never know, maybe 2018 excuse me, will actually be a great year. Jonathan Davis there, economist and wealth advisor.